Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we are digging into a totally fascinating, incredibly complex, and honestly a deeply existential issue, societal demographic collapse. And more specifically, we're looking at the futuristic technology that we all desperately hope might just save us from it. I mean, imagine what a society actually looks like when birth rates plunge. You've got aging populations skyrocketing, economies being severely strained, and the entire structure of the workforce just beginning to buckle. Around the world right now, policymakers facing this are scrambling for solutions in what you could call an outright panic. And you know what the immediate instinct is for a lot of governments? They turn to science. Specifically, assisted reproductive technologies, or ART, things like IVF. It sounds like the perfect, modern, sci-fi fix, doesn't it? Just subsidize the tech, expand access, and watch those birth rates climb right back up to healthy levels. But as we're about to see today, relying on ART as a magic bullet might actually lead us straight into a massive minefield of medical, ethical, and economic challenges. We are going to use an incredibly compelling analysis by Dr. Alexis Hangboon Chin, which focuses on Singapore's specific situation, to really break down the reality of fertility tech. Let's get into it. Okay, let's dive into this because this number right here is the ultimate stakes for our entire discussion today, 0.87. This is the staggering, historically low total fertility rate projected for Singapore in the year 2026. Now, to truly wrap our heads around how drastic this is, we have to look at the baseline. A population needs a replacement rate of about 2.1 just to remain stable. Why 2.1? Well, simply put, you need 2 children to replace the 2 parents, and that extra 0.1 accounts for early mortality and some other statistical variances. So, when a number drops as low as 0.87, you are not just looking at a minor dip, right? You are looking at a structural freefall. It's a genuine existential demographic challenge. And this alarming trend is exactly what prompts these really loud, urgent calls for aggressive government intervention. The immediate public demand is almost always for enhanced financial support, massive public subsidies, and basically loosening all the restrictive regulations around IVF and other reproductive tech. But before any of those sweeping policies are greenlit, we really need to look at the hard data. To understand exactly why this isn't just a simple fix, we're going to follow this roadmap today. First, we'll look at the IVF fix illusion. Second, the public funding dilemma. Third, medical and ethical risks. Fourth, social realities and laws. And finally, emerging tech and the wait-and-see approach. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the IVF fix illusion. There is a massive underlying assumption driving the push for fertility technology. It's the belief that if you just heavily subsidize IVF, you're going to automatically and significantly fix a plunging birth rate. But if you actually look at the global data from other developed nations, ones that already have incredibly robust, really well-funded fertility programs, ART has a very hard ceiling. Assisted reproductive technologies contribute at their absolute maximum to around 10% of a country's total live births. That means the other 90% must come from natural conceptions. Now, don't get me wrong, while that 10% is an absolute miracle for those individual families, on a macro societal level, it's a pretty modest contribution. I mean, think about it. If 90% of our future population relies entirely on natural conception, why are we disproportionately obsessing over the 10%? It is mathematically insufficient to substantially pull a country like Singapore out of a demographic crisis where the fertility rate is sitting below 1.0. The math simply does not support the magic bullet theory. Furthermore, throwing more public money at the problem actually triggers a fascinating yet incredibly frustrating economic reality, and that's diminishing returns. You might naturally think, hey, if we double the IVF budget, we double the babies born, right? But it's actually more like trying to fill a bucket that has a hole in it. The source material highlights that as public funding and financial assistance for IVF expand, those funds tend to get completely absorbed by much more complex and therefore much more expensive medical procedures. So as you open up those financial floodgates, you aren't actually getting a massive wave of new families across the society. Instead, you're just paying for much harder individual medical hurdles. These expanded subsidies end up benefiting a smaller, highly concentrated pool of patients who are facing the absolute most severe fertility issues, rather than generating the broad population growth the government was aiming for in the first place.
Which leads us right into Section 2, the public funding dilemma.
Because once a government decides to actually spend taxpayer money on IVF to boost birth rates, a fierce debate immediately erupts over exactly how and where those subsidies should be spent. A major push from aspiring parents is to extend government IVF co-funding, which is currently mostly used in public hospitals, over to private fertility clinics. And, the argument is totally fair from their perspective. Private clinics offer drastically reduced waiting times and access to highly specialized cutting-edge medical services. But this introduces a really profound ethical and policy clash. Over in private hospitals, life-threatening diseases like cancer and severe heart conditions are absolutely not prioritized for government subsidies. So the question becomes, should public funds really be used to subsidize fertility treatments in private, profit-driven centers when even life-saving cancer treatments aren't given that same treatment? Plus, private clinics are ultimately driven by shareholder profitability. This raises some serious questions about the cost efficiency of funneling public money into that sector, rather than just optimally allocating those funds to enhance and expand the IVF services already existing within the public hospital system itself.
Let's move to our next stop and see how this builds in Section 3, Medical and Ethical Risks. You see, expanding access to fertility treatments isn't just a financial ledger exercise. It opens up profound medical and ethical minefields. A massive debate happening right now revolves around the normalization of a procedure called PGTA. That stands for Preimplantation Genetic Testing for Aneuploidy. Basically, it's the genetic screening of IVF embryos before they are implanted, just to check for the wrong number of chromosomes. Now, proponents argue this is absolutely necessary because older motherhood is on the rise, bringing much higher risks of chromosomal abnormalities, like Down syndrome. Some are even calling for direct subsidies or allowing the use of national medical savings to pay for it. But here are the glaring red flags. PGTA is currently undergoing clinical trials in public hospitals, and the results are incredibly inconclusive. In fact, numerous large-scale, multi-center trials worldwide have consistently shown that PGTA does not significantly improve overall IVF success rates. Because of this, major professional medical bodies in the USA and the UK actively caution against its widespread application. You essentially have desperate parents being sold a very expensive, unproven promise.
And the risks here are not just statistical. They are deeply human and, frankly, highly litigious. There are persistent, grave concerns regarding the reliability of PGTA. What happens if it misdiagnoses a perfectly viable IVF embryo, leading to it being needlessly discarded? The reality of this failure is catastrophic. Consider the Australian fertility company Monash IVF. They had to compensate 700 former IVF patients to the tune of 56 million Australian dollars. Why? Because faulty genetic testing completely compromised those patients' chances of parenthood. The psychological toll of a misdiagnosis resulting in a perfectly viable embryo just being thrown away is unimaginable. Pushing to normalize and subsidize this tech without airtight reliability carries heavy, tangible risks.
Now, what's really interesting about this next point is the ethical deadlock we see over solving the donor shortage. Singapore actually faces a severe shortage of donated sperm, eggs, and embryos because there are strict prohibitions on monetary compensation for donors. It's viewed as an undue financial inducement. But with elective egg freezing legalized recently, there's soon going to be a stockpile of unused frozen eggs. So could these be donated? Well, one side argues that women who donate their unused frozen eggs should be partially compensated to reimburse the hefty medical fees they already paid. But the counter-argument is that these women incurred those fees entirely for their own private reproductive goals. Think of it like this. If you bought a massive insurance policy for yourself and later didn't end up needing it, should the public pay you back just so they can use it? Deciding to donate later doesn't necessarily retroactively turn a private medical expense into a public donation expense.
And then there is the incredibly complex, often dark issue of surrogacy. If a nation permits what's called altruistic surrogacy, where absolutely no profit is supposed to be made, the source material outlines a very strict, almost inevitable cause and effect pipeline that reads a bit like a true crime story. Step 1, altruistic surrogacy is permitted with the absolute best of intentions. Step 2, the overwhelming demand causes black market agencies to covertly emerge to fill the gap. Step 3, these agencies source surrogate mothers, almost exclusively from less economically developed countries, using under-the-table payments to impoverished foreign women. And Step 4, this pipeline inevitably culminates in severe diplomatic fallout over transnational child custody disputes between the intended parents and the foreign surrogate mothers. What starts as a compassionate medical policy to help infertile couples quickly morphs into a severe international ethical crisis.
Moving on to Section 4, Social Realities and Laws.
So, even if we manage to perfectly navigate all those medical and ethical hurdles, fertility technology inevitably crashes headfirst into the rigid behaviors and legal frameworks of society itself. Take elective egg freezing. There are constant proposals out there to extend public subsidies to enable younger women to freeze their eggs when their quality is optimal. Makes sense on paper, right? But overseas studies estimate that less than 1 in 10 women who electively freeze their eggs actually end up using them. I really want to emphasize that in your mind, 90% of frozen eggs never leave the freezer. From a public policy standpoint, subsidizing a procedure where 90% of the output is literally never used raises serious questions about a massive waste of public medical funds.
You aren't just paying for the procedure. You are footing the massive energy and storage bills to maintain these biobanks indefinitely, all on the taxpayer's dime.
And you might be wondering, why aren't they using them? Well, the primary justification for elective egg freezing is that women simply need more time to find a compatible life partner. But here's the catch. Freezing eggs doesn't freeze the underlying social demographics. In countries like Singapore, there are rising numbers of female university graduates. However, there remains a very traditional expectation that women marry men with equal or higher education levels. The mathematical result of this is what's known as the mating gap. There simply aren't enough men fitting that traditional criteria for the growing pool of highly educated women. This persistent incompatibility in marriage expectations is a deeply rooted social reality. Technology can buy you time and it can freeze biology, but it absolutely cannot change the dating pool or force societal marriage expectations to shift.
So the crucial point here is this. Expanding ART isn't just about changing a medical rule. It forces a massive cascade of legal contradictions. It's like science is sprinting ahead while the legal code is merely walking. If you encourage non-traditional family formation by allowing single women to access IVF, that directly contradicts existing public housing policies. In Singapore, for instance, unmarried mothers often face immense hurdles securing HDB flats. Similarly, permitting same-sex partners to access IVF creates a glaring legal incongruity if the state continues to strictly prohibit same-sex marriages. The technology fundamentally outpaces the legal infrastructure, forcing a society to either completely overhaul its entire legal code to accommodate these new family structures or abandon the technological expansion altogether.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Emerging Tech. Wait and see.
Now, when current technology hits its absolute limits, people inevitably look to the future, to advanced, totally sci-fi-sounding treatments. These emerging ARTs include procedures like in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG. Imagine taking a regular skin cell from your arm and in a laboratory coaxing it to turn into a fully functional human sperm or egg. I know it sounds impossible, but it is a novel technology already showing incredible promise in animal studies. Another one is mitochondrial transfer therapy, often called three-parent IVF. This offers a potential solution for older women with poor egg quality by essentially transferring the healthy, youthful contents of an egg from a young donor into the mother's egg. These sound like absolute breakthroughs for people dealing with the most severe, previously incurable fertility problems.
But what should a nation's actual policy be toward this true science fiction? Well, a government could choose to initiate incredibly costly local research and development to chase these breakthroughs. But because Singapore currently lacks foundational research in these specific areas, and the patient pool requiring these extreme measures is tiny, leading the global race is highly unlikely and wildly expensive. The much more prudent, cost-effective strategy? Check the national ego and wait. Allow other much larger countries to bear the massive financial burden of research. Let them make the billion-dollar mistakes. Await the maturation and safety verification of the technology abroad, and then simply import it later through standard licensing agreements. It's a highly pragmatic, deeply effective way to manage healthcare economics.
And that leaves us with a really profound realization today. We've seen that art contributes to just a fraction of overall births. We've talked about the leaky bucket of diminishing economic returns, the absolute ethical minefields of genetic testing and donor compensation, and the undeniable systemic collision with rigid social and legal realities. Which brings us to this final question. Can technology truly solve a demographic crisis, or are we just treating the symptoms? Technology can offer incredible, life-changing miracles for individual families for sure. But if billion-dollar science can only fix 10% of the problem, perhaps the real macroeconomic solution isn't found in a laboratory. Perhaps it's found in how we fundamentally structure our work, our lives, and our society as a whole. Thank you for joining me on this explainer today. Until next time, keep questioning the consensus.